"Mary, just sit quietly and take notes. Let the real negotiators handle this," Trevor Hamilton said, without even looking up from his papers. The conference room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. I gripped my pen tighter, feeling the familiar sting of dismissal wash over me. This was supposed to be the biggest deal of my career at Bright Fern Studios in Portland, Oregon, but once again, I was being relegated to secretary duty while my male colleagues prepared to take credit for months of my work. My name is Mary Lowe, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 6 years, I've been working as a senior business development manager at this mid-sized entertainment production company, consistently bringing in major international partnerships that have kept us profitable. Yet every time we reached the final stages of negotiations, I found myself pushed aside while Trevor and his boys' club stepped in to close the deal. Today was different, though. Today, I had information they didn't know I possessed. The investor we were meeting with was Zhang Wei, the founder of Golden Phoenix Entertainment, one of the largest media conglomerates in Asia. His company was worth over $2 billion, and this partnership could triple our revenue within 2 years. I had spent 8 months cultivating this relationship, learning about his business philosophy, his family traditions, and yes, perfecting my Mandarin through intensive courses that I paid for myself. Trevor and his team had no idea about any of this preparation. "Trevor, I should mention that Mr. Zhang prefers," I began, but he cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Mary, please, we've got this handled. Just focus on getting good notes for the follow-up report." His condescending smile made my stomach turn. Beside him, Brad Kimmel and Jason Torres nodded in agreement, their smugness practically radiating from their expensive suits. What they didn't realize was that their arrogance was about to cost them everything. I had received a text from Zhang Wei's assistant 30 minutes ago, informing me that he would be arriving early and that he specifically requested to speak with the woman who understood his vision. They assumed it was a translation error. I knew better. The foundation they thought was so solid beneath their feet was actually built on quicksand, and I was about to pull the rug out from under them in a way that would leave them scrambling for years to recover. The path that led me to this moment began 3 years ago, when I first started working on international partnerships. I had always been fascinated by different cultures and languages, but it wasn't until I met Zhang Wei at a trade conference in Los Angeles that I realized how much my company was missing by sending culturally tone-deaf negotiators to handle delicate international relationships. Growing up in a working-class family in Sacramento, I had learned early that success required more than just talent. It demanded strategy, patience, and the ability to see opportunities that others missed. My parents, both teachers, had instilled in me the value of education and cultural understanding. When they sacrificed to send me to business school, I promised myself I would never waste the advantages their hard work had given me. At Bright Fern Studios, I had initially been thrilled to join what seemed like a progressive, creative environment. The company produced independent films and documentaries that often tackled important social issues. But I quickly discovered that their progressive values didn't extend to their internal hierarchy. The executive team was exclusively male, and despite my MBA from Stanford and my track record of successful deal-making, I was consistently passed over for promotions while less qualified men advanced around me. Trevor Hamilton, our director of business development, had been my biggest obstacle. At 42, he possessed the kind of old-school charisma that impressed older executives but lacked any real substance when it came to modern international business. He had built his career on handshake deals with local distributors and had no understanding of the cultural nuances required for global partnerships. Yet when I brought Zhang Wei's company to the table, Trevor immediately claimed credit for identifying this opportunity and positioned himself as the lead negotiator. Brad Kimmel, our marketing director, was Trevor's loyal sidekick, a yes man who contributed little beyond echoing Trevor's opinions in meetings. Jason Torres, the finance director, was slightly more competent but equally dismissive of my contributions. Together, they formed an impenetrable wall of masculine mediocrity that had blocked my advancement for far too long. What they didn't know was that Zhang Wei had specifically sought me out after our initial meeting. He had been impressed not just by my business acumen, but by my genuine interest in understanding Chinese business culture. Over the past 8 months, we had exchanged numerous emails discussing everything from market trends to philosophy. I had mentioned my language studies, and he had encouraged me to continue, even recommending specific texts that would help me understand the subtleties of formal business Mandarin. The irony was delicious. While Trevor and his team were preparing their typical American-style high-pressure sales pitch, Zhang Wei was expecting a thoughtful, culturally sensitive discussion about long-term partnership goals. They were about to walk into a cultural minefield, and I was holding the only map to safe passage. The moment that crystallized my resolve came 2 weeks before the Zhang Wei meeting, during our quarterly review session. I had just finished presenting the preliminary terms I had negotiated with Golden Phoenix Entertainment, terms that were significantly more favorable than any deal in our company's history. The room was silent as the executives absorbed the numbers. A 3-year exclusive distribution agreement, guaranteed minimum advances of $15 million, and profit-sharing terms that could potentially bring in another $20 million annually. "Excellent work, Trevor," said Patrick Westbrook, our chief executive officer, without even glancing in my direction. "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need more of around here." I felt my face burn with indignation. "Actually, Patrick, I was the one who—" Trevor smoothly interrupted. "Mary's been a great support on this project. Really solid note-taking and research assistance." He shot me a warning look that clearly said to stay in my lane. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the contract terms I had meticulously negotiated, each clause representing hours of careful research into Chinese business law and cultural preferences. Zhang Wei had praised my understanding of Guanxi, the complex system of relationships and reciprocal obligations that underpins Chinese business culture. Yet here I was, watching 3 men prepare to take credit for work they couldn't have conceived of, let alone executed. I made a decision that would change everything. I called Zhang Wei's assistant and requested a private meeting to discuss cultural preparation for our upcoming negotiation. During that video call, conducted entirely in Mandarin, Zhang Wei and I had a frank discussion about the challenges of cross-cultural business relationships. He shared his frustration with American companies that sent executives who showed no respect for Chinese customs or took the time to understand the deeper philosophical aspects of business partnerships. "Mary," he said in perfect English, switching languages for emphasis, "you understand that business is about more than contracts. It is about trust, respect, and shared vision. I hope your colleagues share this understanding." I assured him that our company valued long-term relationships over quick profits, even as I knew that Trevor's team was planning exactly the opposite approach. That conversation planted the seed of an idea that had been growing ever since. If my colleagues insisted on treating me as invisible, perhaps it was time to let them discover just how much they depended on my visibility. The beautiful part was that they had created this situation themselves. Their consistent dismissal of my contributions had led them to underestimate not just my capabilities, but my connections. They saw me as a useful assistant who could handle preliminary research while they swooped in for the glory. What they failed to realize was that in the modern global economy, relationships mattered more than ego, and cultural competence trumped traditional networking every single time. As I watched them prepare for what they assumed would be their triumphant moment, I couldn't help but smile. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about respect. The morning of the Zhang Wei meeting arrived with typical Portland drizzle, and I arrived at the office an hour early to ensure everything was perfect. The conference room had been set up according to Zhang Wei's preferences, a detail I had communicated to our facilities team directly, since Trevor's group hadn't bothered to ask about such minor details. The chairs were arranged to face east, green tea was prepared instead of coffee, and I had personally ensured that the presentation materials were printed on high-quality paper without any red ink, which would be considered unlucky. Trevor, Brad, and Jason arrived 30 minutes before the meeting, their energy electric with anticipation. They huddled around the conference table, rehearsing their presentation one final time. I noticed that Trevor had even bought a new tie for the occasion. navy blue with subtle gold threading that he probably thought looked international. "Mary, make sure you get everything on record," Trevor said, gesturing toward the notebook I carried. "This is going to be a masterclass in high-level negotiation. You might learn something." I nodded politely, though inside I was counting down the minutes until their world would start crumbling. At exactly 2 p.m., our receptionist called to announce that Mr. Zhang had arrived. Trevor straightened his tie, Brad cleared his throat nervously, and Jason shuffled through his financial projections one last time. Jiang Wei entered the conference room with his usual quiet dignity, accompanied by 2 assistants. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, and his demeanor was politely formal, but noticeably cool. I watched as Trevor stepped forward with his broadest smile, extending his hand for an aggressive American-style handshake. "Mr. Zhang, welcome to Brightfern Studios. I'm Trevor Hamilton, Director of Business Development. We're absolutely thrilled to finally close this deal with you." Jiang Wei accepted the handshake briefly, his expression remaining neutral. His eyes swept the room, lingering on me for just a moment longer than the others, and I caught the slightest nod of acknowledgement. Trevor, oblivious to the subtle signs of discomfort, launched immediately into his presentation. "We've put together what I think you'll agree is an incredibly generous offer," Trevor continued, spreading his papers across the table with theatrical flair. "Golden Phoenix Entertainment is getting access to our entire catalog, plus first rights to any new productions. We're talking about a relationship that could make both our companies very rich, very quickly." I watched Jiang Wei's face carefully and saw the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated displeasure. In Chinese business culture, discussing money so directly at the beginning of a meeting was considered crude and disrespectful. Trevor was unknowingly insulting one of the most powerful media executives in Asia, and he was too culturally ignorant to realize it. Furthermore, Brad jumped in, apparently unable to contain his enthusiasm. "We think there's huge potential for product placement opportunities in your Chinese market. American brands are really hot over there right now, and we could package some lucrative endorsement deals with our talent." Now Jiang Wei's expression shifted to something approaching distaste. The casual dismissal of Chinese preferences, the assumption that Chinese audiences simply wanted American products pushed at them. Every word out of Brad's mouth was digging their grave deeper. Jason, sensing some tension but misreading its source, tried to rescue the situation with numbers. "The financial projections we've prepared show potential returns of up to 30% in the first 18 months. We're looking at this as a fast-track partnership that could really accelerate both companies' growth curves." Jiang Wei finally spoke, his English precise and measured. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, gentlemen. However, I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of the partnership I have been discussing with your company." Trevor's confidence flickered for just a moment. "Misunderstanding? I think our terms are pretty straightforward, Mr. Zhang. This is a very generous deal for your company." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jiang Wei's assistants exchanged glances, and I could see that we were approaching the point of no return. This was the moment I had been preparing for. Jiang Wei's voice remained carefully controlled, but I could detect the underlying steel in his tone. "Mr. Hamilton, I believe there has been significant miscommunication regarding both the scope and philosophy of this potential partnership. The discussions I have been having with your company have focused on cultural exchange, mutual respect, and long-term sustainable growth. What you are presenting sounds more like a colonial extraction model." Trevor's face reddened slightly, but he pressed forward with the oblivious confidence that had carried him through his entire career. "Colonial? Come on, Mr. Zhang. This is just good business. We both make money, everybody wins. Sometimes you have to move fast in this industry." "Move fast and break things, as you Americans say," Jiang Wei replied, and I recognized the deliberate misquote of the Silicon Valley motto. He was testing them, seeing if anyone in the room understood the subtle criticism embedded in his response. Brad, completely missing the nuance, laughed and nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. That's the entrepreneurial spirit we're talking about. We're disruptors in the entertainment space." Jason, perhaps sensing that something was going wrong but unable to identify the problem, tried a different approach. Mr. Zhang, maybe we could walk through the financial models in more detail. I think once you see the projected returns, you'll understand why this deal makes sense for both parties. Zhang Wei turned his attention to Jason with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Mr. Torres, profitability is not my primary concern in this partnership. Golden Phoenix Entertainment already generates significant revenue. What interests me is the opportunity to create content that bridges cultures, tells authentic stories, and builds genuine understanding between our peoples. This requires partners who share those values, not simply those who see Chinese audiences as consumers to be exploited. The silence that followed was deafening. Trevor, Brad, and Jason exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly realizing that their standard pitch was not resonating, but having no idea how to adjust their approach. They had prepared to sell a product, not to discuss philosophy or cultural exchange. Trevor cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the situation. Of course, Mr. Zhang, cultural understanding is important to us too. That's why we brought Mary along. She's been doing research on, cultural aspects of the deal. For the first time since the meeting began, all eyes turned to me. Zhang Wei's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of genuine interest since he had entered the room. Trevor, Brad, and Jason looked at me expectantly, clearly hoping I could somehow salvage their disastrous presentation. Mary has been very thorough in her research, Trevor continued, apparently deciding to throw me under the bus rather than admit his own cultural incompetence. Maybe she can address some of your concerns about cultural sensitivity. I felt a familiar surge of anger at being volunteered to clean up their mess, but this time it was mixed with anticipation. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The opportunity to show them exactly what they had been dismissing for the past 3 years. Zhang Wei leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on me now. Miss Lo, I would be very interested to hear your perspective on how our companies might work together in a way that honors both cultures. Trevor nodded at me encouragingly, still believing that I would somehow rescue his failed negotiation and allow him to take credit for whatever success might follow. Brad and Jason looked relieved that someone else was being asked to handle the increasingly awkward situation. They had no idea that they had just handed me the keys to their professional destruction. I set down my pen and closed my notebook, the small gesture somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Zhang Wei watched me with growing interest, while Trevor, Brad, and Jason waited expectantly for me to somehow translate their crude sales pitch into something culturally appropriate. Mr. Zhang, I began, my voice steady and confident. I believe the disconnect here stems from fundamentally different approaches to business relationships. Trevor and his team are operating from a transactional mindset. They see this as a simple exchange of content for money. Trevor nodded approvingly, apparently thinking I was about to support his position. Exactly, Mary. Sometimes these cultural differences can make simple business deals seem more complicated than they need to be. I felt a moment of almost physical satisfaction as I prepared to demolish his assumptions. Actually, Trevor, I was about to explain why that approach is exactly wrong for this partnership. The room went quiet. Trevor's confident smile faltered as he realized I wasn't supporting his position. Brad and Jason looked confused, unable to understand why I would contradict our own team in front of a potential client. I turned back to Zhang Wei and switched effortlessly to Mandarin. 尊敬的张先生，我想我们需要重新开始这次对话。这些同事对于建立真正伙伴关系的复杂性缺乏理解。Respected Mr. Zhang, I think we need to restart this conversation. These colleagues lack understanding of the complexities involved in building a true partnership. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Zhang Wei's entire demeanor transformed, his formal politeness replaced by genuine engagement and respect. His assistants straightened in their chairs, clearly surprised, but pleased by this unexpected development. Trevor's mouth fell open in shock. Mary, what are you... Since when do you speak Chinese? I ignored him completely, continuing my conversation with Zhang Wei in fluent Mandarin. 我花了很多时间研究贵公司的价值观和目标。我相信我们可以建立一个基于相互尊重和长期远景的伙伴关系。I have spent considerable time studying your company's values and goals. I believe we can build a partnership based on mutual respect and long-term vision. Zhang Wei responded enthusiastically, also in Mandarin. 罗女士，这正是我一直希望的对话类型。你对文化桥梁建设的理解让我印象深刻。Miss Lo, this is exactly the type of conversation I have been hoping for. I am impressed by your understanding of cultural bridge building. As our conversation continued, I could see Trevor, Brad, and Jason becoming increasingly agitated. They couldn't understand what we were discussing, but they could certainly read Zhang Wei's body language, which had shifted from polite tolerance to animated engagement. Finally, Trevor interrupted desperately. Mary, could you please translate what you're discussing? We need to stay involved in these negotiations. I looked at him with the same dismissive expression he had given me countless times over the past 3 years. Actually, Trevor, Mr. Zhang and I are discussing whether this partnership can move forward at all, given the fundamental misalignment he's observed between his values and the approach your team has taken. Zhang Wei nodded gravely and spoke in English for the benefit of the others. Miss Lo has articulated exactly my concerns. This partnership requires partners who understand that success is measured not just in immediate profits, but in the lasting value created through respectful collaboration. The moment had arrived. I stood up calmly, my decision crystal clear. Mr. Zhang, given the circumstances, perhaps we should discuss this partnership through a different structure. My independent consulting rate is 15% of the deal value. Shall we proceed without them? The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated, and I watched with deep satisfaction as the realization of what I had just done began to dawn on Trevor's face. Zhang Wei's response was immediate and decisive. Miss Lo, that would be my preferred approach. I believe you understand both the scope and spirit of what I am trying to accomplish. The silence in the conference room was deafening. Trevor's face cycled through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, dawning horror as he realized what had just happened. Brad looked like he had been slapped, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Jason was frantically flipping through his papers, as if he could somehow find a clause that would prevent this disaster. Wait, Trevor stammered, his voice cracking slightly. Mary, you can't just... This is Brightfern's deal. You work for us. This is corporate theft. I gathered my notebook and pen with deliberate calm, savoring every second of their panic. Actually, Trevor, I developed this relationship on my own time, using my own resources, and conducting all substantive negotiations independently. I've been documenting everything very carefully over the past 8 months. I opened my bag and pulled out a thick folder. Every email, every cultural briefing, every point of connection between Golden Phoenix Entertainment and what they thought was Brightfern Studios was actually between Golden Phoenix Entertainment and Mary Lo Consulting. Zhang Wei's assistant had already pulled out a tablet and was taking notes. Miss Lo, should we schedule a follow-up meeting to finalize the partnership terms? Absolutely, I replied, still speaking primarily in Mandarin, but switching to English to ensure Trevor understood exactly what was happening. I believe we can have a formal agreement drafted within 2 weeks. Trevor shot to his feet, his face now completely red. This is unethical. Mary, you can't take our client and start your own consulting firm. Your client? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Trevor, you've spent this entire meeting demonstrating that you don't understand the first thing about Mr. Zhang's business model, values, or cultural expectations. You've insulted him repeatedly, dismissed his priorities, and reduced his vision to a simple cash grab. Exactly which part of that constitutes a successful client relationship? Zhang Wei stood and extended his hand to me in a gesture of formal respect that was completely different from the perfunctory handshake he had given Trevor. Miss Lo, it has been a pleasure working with someone who truly understands the importance of cultural partnership. I look forward to our continued collaboration. As Zhang Wei and his assistants gathered their materials, I turned to face my former colleagues one final time. The three men who had spent years dismissing my contributions, taking credit for my work, and treating me like an overpaid secretary, now looked absolutely devastated. "How long have you been planning this?" Brad asked weakly. "I wasn't planning anything," I replied honestly. "I was simply preparing to do my job well, which apparently was such a foreign concept to you that you never saw it coming. Every time you pushed me aside or took credit for my work, you were training Mr. Zhang to see me as the competent professional and you as the obstacles to be removed." Jason finally found his voice. "The company is going to sue you into bankruptcy. You can't just steal a $15 million deal." I smiled, feeling genuinely sorry for them for the first time. "Jason, there is no deal to steal. You just spent an hour systematically destroying any possibility of a partnership between Zhang Wei and Brightfern Studios. I'm not taking anything from you. I'm salvaging value from the wreckage you created." Zhang Wei paused at the door and addressed the room in English. "Gentlemen, I want to be very clear about something. Miss Lo did not steal this opportunity from you. You gave it to her through your own actions and attitudes. In Chinese business culture, we have a saying, 'The superior man is modest in his speech, but exceeds in his actions.' Today, you have shown us exactly the opposite." With that, he walked out, and I followed, leaving Trevor, Brad, and Jason sitting in stunned silence around their useless presentation materials, finally understanding that their careers at Brightfern Studios were effectively over. Within 3 months of my departure from Brightfern Studios, the company's international division completely collapsed. Trevor Hamilton was demoted to Regional Sales Coordinator, a position that paid $30,000 less than his previous role and required him to report to a woman 15 years younger than him. Brad Kimmel was let go entirely after the company discovered that his marketing strategies had alienated 3 other potential international partners. Jason Torres managed to keep his position, but only after accepting a significant pay cut and agreeing to undergo extensive cultural sensitivity training. Meanwhile, Patrick Westbrook, the chief executive officer who had consistently overlooked my contributions, found himself explaining to the board of directors how his company had lost a potentially transformative partnership due to what the industry trade publications were calling breathtaking cultural incompetence. The Golden Phoenix Entertainment deal became a cautionary tale that was discussed in business schools and international trade seminars across the country. As I sat in my new office overlooking the Willamette River, reviewing proposals from 3 major Asian entertainment conglomerates who had heard about my successful partnership with Zhang Wei, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The revenge I had taken wasn't born from anger, but from a simple refusal to accept that my value should be determined by people who couldn't recognize it. And sometimes, the sweetest victory comes not from destroying your enemies, but from succeeding so completely that they destroy themselves.